We thought we'd do a video on TIG versus MIG, why we would use different ones, and why they're why they are the main two types of welding you'll see in exhaust components. So the first thing, which is the most obvious thing to most people, is how they look. Now, forgetting that the two examples we've got here look different because of the surface finish of the actual tube, what we've got are two very visually different styles of welding. So if we take these joints here, for example, we've got really small, really precise TIG welds here, and then the kind of MIG welded joint we've got here is obviously much wider. There's obviously a lot more material been put in here. This is really where the primary visual difference comes in. It's just in how much bigger MIG welding tends to be. TIG welding isn't always nice colours, you know, golden or rainbow colours like that. Sometimes you'll see TIG welding that's really grey and oxidised. But what you see here with these MIG welds is that's kind of your standard off-the-shelf exhaust type work. So we've got like really wide weld bead, and it's kind of it's a process that requires a lot less accuracy and a lot less skill to actually carry out. TIG welding is essentially a two-handed, one-foot process. You know, you've got one hand that holds the torch, one hand that puts the filler material in, and then you've got your foot, which is controlling the power. So it takes a long time to learn how to TIG weld to a high standard, and not very long at all to learn how to MIG weld to a high standard. So they're the two like biggest differences in terms of the kind of visual of things. Because MIG welding is a much bigger type of weld, it's much wider usually, there's a lot more material that gets put in. It means that you don't actually have to be anywhere near as accurate with the fit up of the parts. You could have a gap between the two pieces you were trying to weld together, and you'd be able to MIG weld that up no problem. With TIG, that's just not possible. You know, you really need really tight gaps, and that means that the whole process is a lot more time consuming to do. We've got to make sure that everything's kind of millimetre perfect before we can even begin the welding process, and you just don't have that disadvantage with MIG welding. You can just chop your pipe, doesn't really matter if it's that accurate, and you can just, you know, pull that trigger and load it up with material which will bridge that gap. So TIG welding is a much more time-consuming process in terms of starting with raw materials and ending with something that you can use on the car, because it's a much slower process, not just in terms of the fit-up, but actually in the welding. It takes a long time to kind of go around a pipe and complete a full weld joint, and it's much more precise. With MIG welding, you just kind of pull the trigger, the material comes out, and you can fly around stuff. So that's where the big visual differences come in. And then when it comes to stuff like why it's better in terms of reliability, and it's because with TIG welding, because it is a much more precise process, you can really control the heat input, because you're doing that with your foot. So you can control the heat input and the amount of filler material that gets added with each dab to that joint. With MIG, when you pull that trigger, the wire will come out at a preset speed. The amperage is set to a preset. You can't adjust those things in the middle of the weld. So TIG is a far more precise, far more controlled type of welding. And that's why you see it in motorsport applications, where they're looking for they want the most reliable thing possible. They want it to be so reliable, and the cost doesn't come into it. And obviously, because TIG welding takes so much longer to do, the welding process and all the fit up involved, it means that it is inevitably more expensive. And that reliability comes in especially on things like downpipes. So downpipes are obviously at the very front of the exhaust system, and that's where we see the most amount of heat. So the most amount of heat is pushing that material the hardest in terms of heat cycles and the very peak temperatures it sees. And that's when you need the strongest, most reliable welds, because you're going to get those. If something's going to break, it's going to be that. It's going to be in those kinds of areas on downpipes and things like that. So you really want to make sure that in those areas you have got the most reliable type of welding you can provide, and that's always going to be TIG. And again, that's it. That's why you will see it in motorsport applications. You won't see any MIG welded downpipes or exhaust systems on a professional kind of outfitted race car, and obviously never in like Formula One or World Endurance car or anything like that. It's always going to be TIG welded. One of the disadvantages with TIG, which is potentially a disadvantage but is mostly actually an advantage, is that you must back purge with TIG. So just like I said that how some TIG welding you see won't be colourful, won't be gold or kind of like rainbow colours, it will be grey. Not all TIG welding you see is back purged, but it is critical, because we need to make sure that on the back side of that weld, as it is welded, we've got argon gas which keeps the weld pool from oxidizing. We need to make sure that we keep it as strong and as nice as possible on the inside. So that means that it is an extra process. So we've got to make sure that we do that, or we end up with something that could potentially be less reliable than something that's MIG welded. Because MIG welding doesn't necessarily mean unreliability, but it does mean that poor TIG welding with no backwood purge is most likely to be less reliable than MIG welding. So this is where you really have to do your research, because just because something looks good, and this is where a lot of the Chinese downpipes come in, a lot of the Chinese exhaust systems, you're never going to find any of those have been back purged. They actually tend to do quite a bit of cheating in terms of making their welds look pretty as well. They'll tend to do a weld which will be grey and all oxidised and horrible, and then they'll grind it down, and then they'll actually pulse with the TIG welder over the top of it, and that's how they make it kind of look attractive. They're kind of cheating, and that means that actually underneath you have got a weld that's full of oxidisation and porosity and is probably not going to be reliable. So I guess to summarise, TIG welding, if done correctly, should be far more reliable, far better looking and more attractive than a MIG welded part. There's more skill and time involved in it, and to somebody that spends the time it takes to do TIG welded parts correctly, it is like an art form. It is a very highly skilled job, and you can be really bad at it. MIG welding, once you know the process, and once you've got a machine set up, people can learn to MIG weld very fast. With TIG welding, it takes hours and hours. But you do end up with what is ultimately a better product that will inevitably be more reliable, and it's something that you can be really proud of.